Welcome to the Movie Business Podcast, picking up where Movie Business Book left off. I'm Jason Squire, bringing you a wide range of industry talent and executives to answer fundamental questions about the business. Today, we're getting into the secrets of covering movie business with DADE Hayes, the New York business editor at Deadline Hollywood, who writes about media business, as well as television, film, advertising, and theater. During a 10-year run at Variety, he led the New York editorial team after serving in Los Angeles as an editor and reporter. He's the author, with Dawn Chmielewski, of Binge Times, Inside Hollywood's Furious Billion-Dollar Battle to Take Down Netflix. Welcome, Dade.
So great to be with you, Jason. Thank you for having me.
Well, it's a pleasure that we could spend time together across the coasts. So let me ask, to start off, in your sense, what are the secrets of covering media business?
Well, in 2022, which is a different climate, a different atmosphere than when I started out, of course, you have to be omnivorous, I would say. You have to be able to take in and interpret information across a huge array of, the dashboard now looks like a 777 aircraft, with all these different dials, podcasts, social media, of course, traditional media, television. And, increasingly actors themselves or directors themselves are making news through their own accounts. So, you kind of have to be ready for things to pop up at a moment's notice. Sometimes you even stumble upon them yourself, with just in the field or in your travels. And just trusting your gut has never been more important, but it's admittedly tougher to do now that there's so much input out there.
So do you have a sense of leeway as to who decides on the stories? How does that work?
At Deadline, we have a lot of autonomy, I think, to pursue stories that we see arising. We're breaking a lot of news ourselves. Obviously, that's kind of in our DNA. And we're, holding down beats kind of independently without too much centralized authority. However, like any newsroom or quasi or virtual newsroom, there is a hierarchy, and we're sometimes given assignments or planned coverage. Great example would be awards shows. We don't want a free-for-all when it's the Emmy Awards or the Oscars. We, in fact, my colleagues in LA painstakingly assemble kind of a battle plan for major events like that. Similarly, we're just now in earnings season, so we have a big batch of corporate earnings coming, some of which even go beyond my beat, which is business. And, you have implications on the film and television business in general, companies like Netflix and Disney, of course, and many others. So, it's the combination of organization and flexibility, but I'd say we have a lot of freedom to pursue what we see out there. But we're also covering a lot. So freedom, but also a pretty vigorous tempo of activity.
Wow, that's a good way of putting it. So how do you deal with the powerful marketing mechanisms of companies in order to get your information?
Oh, that is such an age-old and very relevant question. I mean, it in a way, it's been an issue, I think, for publications like Deadline for decades. We do take knocks from time to time for being too close to those marketing machines. I would dispute that to some extent. I think we do cover things closely. We're the modern version of the trades, that people talk about in the business, where it used to be a few thousand people a day reading print editions of magazines like Variety or The Hollywood Reporter. Today, the trades, quote unquote, can encompass a few different things. And Deadline, 30 million unique visitors, a month, isn't quite the exact same thing as the old trades, but it's a pretty close. It's an echo of those days. And so, but back to your question, I think we haven't, certain things we do because if a trumpet fanfare is coming from a particular studio, we're not obligated to amplify that trumpet fanfare, but you could say it's news, just as if Procter & Gamble rolls out a new ad blitz and advertising age would write about it because that's kind of what they cover. So we engage with the industry, I would say, very closely on a granular level. But I think some of our best work comes when we go into areas where we're not invited or where we try to deliberately circumvent that marketing machine, or at least critique it, hold it up to the light. I think we are very capable of that. We do it pretty much every day. And that's always the trick. I like some kind of balanced diet where it's not just all there. A few social media accounts, blogs, things I track that are so outside that they can be a little strident and maybe less informed. So the trick is to be informed, to have an inside track and know what's going on and speak regularly to the companies, but also not just completely take their spin or their gloss at face value, but to kind of question it, be in a dialogue with it. So,
well, you've just this begs the question of what your favorite sites are. Where do you go snooping around that anyone can find?
There are many. I will say happily, because it was a very monolithic marketplace, for decades until the internet kind of broke things open. And now it feels more, multifaceted than ever. I mean, there are some fast rising new players in Puck Media and The Ankler, both really strong, very sort of voicey, informed, newsletter based outlets, and they keep us on our toes. I like to read those guys a lot. I will go to unlikely places. I mean, I just like to follow a lot of people on Twitter. I don't know if I go to sites as much as I used to. I think, like a lot of people, I've fallen out of that habit because of the way social media just has kind of disintermediated that whole process of going to latimes.com, going to, certain individual brand sites. So a lot of stuff travels very quickly. I try to do a survey of the major newspapers every day, and more than every day, almost every hour, just to be thorough. I'm listening to NPR and podcasts and other things, trying to watch CNBC, because in our world, in the business side of things, a lot of newsmakers appear on CNBC or in other TV venues, and that can always be part of our diet. So it's kind of just a little bit of everything. You have to be a pretty avid consumer of media to cover the media, I think. So I try to play the field.
I think it sounds like, it sounds like it's...
I've given you a bit of an evasive answer in that it's my favorite sites are all sites in a sense.
Yeah.
I'll read anything.
And of course, all that research is a full day's work, so I don't see how you have time to write the stories. But speaking of writing, I want to turn to your fabulous book, Binge Times. I want to recommend it strongly to all our listeners. It's a wonderful book. It's highly informative, compelling, and really well written. It's just a great read that weaves together the history of streaming with emphasis on Netflix. I don't think that anything has been done in this arena as clearly and as authoritatively as the book Binge Times. So what are the lessons learned from writing this kind of book?
Well, thank you, first of all, for all of that incredibly kind praise. Very, very much appreciated. And I wish Dawn were here to take her well-deserved equal share of that credit. We set out to document this white-hot moment. We started off in 2019, and we were trying to basically capture this frenzy of activity. If you recall, this was when a lot of the big boulders were being rolled into formation, these giant multi-billion-dollar enterprises that finally were going to go up against the big guys, Netflix, Amazon, Hulu. They were finally going to be more robust competitors, which really had never existed. And so then came COVID. I'll skip the big saga of COVID, but and then what was interesting to us and what we did learn along the way is you can't really handicap. I mean, one of the really fun things about narrative nonfiction is you kind of start off thinking, okay, this is my hero and this is the villain and this twist will happen in the second act and then we'll get to the third act. And of course, COVID just upended so much. So that was a major unexpected factor. And then the things that were down were then up again. When we started off, if you recall, when Apple TV Plus launched on November 1st of 2019, reviews were really mixed. They had the morning show, that was a marquee property, but not everybody loved it. And they didn't have Ted Lasso. They didn't have Coda. They hadn't really kind of found themselves or found any kind of identity. I would argue they maybe still are getting there, but they have much more traction today. Similarly, HBO Max, which we document exhaustively in the book as this fruit of a sort of poisoned tree, in effect. Like, it was really the product of a terrible sequence of mergers, and one in particular with AT&T, where they took over Time Warner and just kind of bollocks up that whole thing, as I think even they have admitted. There were what was fascinating and kept us really stimulated all the way through was how unpredictable it was, and how you always have to be willing to kind of, I know you're at USC with tons of screenwriters and your fellow professors teaching the art of writing a script. You kind of sometimes have to move those index cards around the cork board, and what you thought would be a great scene 2/3 of the way into the book suddenly becomes, one of your opening scenes. And there was a lot of that, but actually I think that's the only way to arrive at a compelling finished product. And we felt like it was certainly worth that toil.
Wow. And thanks again for writing that book.
I'm so appreciative that it struck a chord. Your esteem for the book means the world to us, Jason. So thank you so much.
Oh, thank you. Now, I wanted to sort of widen to a broader assessment of the business. What's your prognosis for the business?
Well, it's going through a very anxious time. I mean, any sector obviously has felt frazzled this year with all the macroeconomic factors. Inflation, there's been conflict in many regions of the world, particularly in Europe. There's obviously been supply chain. I mean, I could go on a whole list. I'm not an economist, but it's really wreaking havoc with all kinds of sectors. The media business is no different. But layering on top of that is the ongoing cord cutting. I mean, it is accelerating. I think when a couple of years ago, when I would ask people where do you think the bundle settles out? In other words, when do we kind of hit bottom with that pay TV bundle, which of course is the most lucrative business ever created. I mean, it just threw off so much cash for so many years, and now they're losing the big media companies. So they're on their back foot a little bit because they're trying to manage declining businesses, which would be linear TV networks, and increasingly the motion picture business. I tend to be a little more upbeat about movies going forward theatrically. I mean, just given a few of the rays of sunshine we've gotten recently. However, you can't be too Pollyanna when you really look at the numbers. They're pretty sobering. I don't know that we'll get to the levels where we were in 2019. So that's also technically a business that's less than it used to be. So you have these traditional enterprises. Disney is marking 100 years as a company. Warner Brothers is almost 100-year-old studio. I mean, these are very well-entrenched enterprises that have a certain way of doing business. And they've faced this intense competition now from companies that don't have the same concern about spending. Apple, Amazon, even Netflix. I know there's this air of austerity and they're going to be cutting back. I think they're still very capable of spending. And just the fact that they're saying they're not going to increase spending, well, they're still at $17 billion a year in content spending. So anyway, where does all this leave everybody? I mean, I do think it's going to get tougher before it gets any easier for any companies that are managing these declining assets. So it's hard to, if I'm going to put a wager down, it's hard to really bet on the traditional guys. Although if they have enough, like Disney has shown it has quite a powerhouse collection of assets, including theme parks, including sports. I mean, it has things that can sustain it. But I don't know. I've started to feel like maybe the Amazon MGM deal is like a sign of the times. I do wonder if for years it had been this puzzle. Steve Jobs and Bob Iger are really good friends. Does that mean that Apple's going to buy Disney? And, is that going to happen?
Wow.
Of course, that didn't happen. But there's just always been this intrigue of like, could tech and media come together? And I kind of do feel like that's where we're going. I mean, there was a report that just came out the other day that Netflix and Paramount had merger discussions.
We're going to be following that really closely, but we're going to be, it was such a pleasure hosting you because I read you closely in Deadline. Let's thank DADE Hayes for being a wonderful guest on the Movie Business Podcast.